Hello and welcome to the next session, that is Selenium versus Cypress. So this is one of the topic which everyone looks for whenever, especially when people are moving from Selenium to Cypress, or they want to evaluate what is the difference between Selenium test automation tool and Cypress. Because Selenium is there in the market from almost 10 years now, not even 10 years, rather more than that. It is in fact there from 15 to 20 years now. It's been famous from last 10 years. So why they should move from Selenium to Cypress? So I've tried listing down some of the reasons. So this is not the exhaustive list, but yes, it will give you a good idea. And rest of the things which I might not cover here will be covered during the sessions. So let's start with it. The first thing is Cypress is a complete framework. It has everything. It has all the dependent libraries like Mocha testing framework, assertion libraries, and so on. Whereas Selenium in itself is a library. It is not a framework. It to use it, you have to integrate it with other tools like TestNG or JUnit, which are the testing framework, and many more other libraries. Like for generating report, you need to add log4j. Whereas in Cypress, everything is inbuilt. So in very simple terms, Cypress is a complete framework. You don't need much of extra things. Whereas Selenium in itself is a testing library, you need other tools to make it complete or make it a framework. Then Cypress works inside the browser and does have the control over the application that tests everything that runs in the browser, like all the network commands and everything, which we discussed during the architecture as well, and is very fast and reliable. Whereas Selenium communicates via browser using JSON wire protocol, and it depends on the browser driver to communicate to the browser. So if you have worked with Selenium, you might remember that to work with Chrome browser, we need a Chrome driver.exe. So it's not very straightforward. You need to have that exe, and then all the communication happens with that. Then Cypress is a testing framework and is not recommended for any general purpose automation or administrative task. Whereas Selenium, what it says is Selenium automates browser. Now, what you do with that power is up to you. You can do all the administrative tasks like filling up timesheet or many other automation tasks you can perform. Whereas Cypress is mainly focused on testing the application. It's built to test the application rather than doing any other administrative tasks. Then one of the reason why Cypress has actually becoming famous is the automatic wait. Now, one of the biggest challenge we face with Selenium or other similar automation tools is application synchronization. Like the application the test has its own speed of execution, whereas the application code or the test code you have written has its own speed. So the synchronization between the two is important, and it's difficult to achieve in Selenium or other tools. Whereas in Cypress, it's automatic. You don't have to write any extra line of code. It automatically takes care of synchronizing the application. Then Cypress supports only JavaScript. That's the language of the browser. So they are not going to support any other language. They're only going to support JavaScript. Whereas Selenium supports all the famous languages, Java, C Sharp, Python, Ruby, Perl. And that was one of the reason actually Cypress, this Selenium became famous. But since Cypress has a different purpose, the main purpose of it is to test the UI, test the application. They're not going to support any other language. And the good part is that you don't need any solid programming language to learn Cypress. It's very basic JavaScript is what required. And whatever is required, I'll be covering during this course. Whereas when you're working with Selenium, you need a very good knowledge of programming language and object-oriented concepts. So next point is Cypress can be used for testing both the UI as well as the API. Since it runs in the same browser as your application to test, and it has control over all the network commands, so it can also be used to test all the APIs. Whereas Selenium only supports UI testing. It does not support any API testing. Then a code in Cypress is asynchronous, and it has its own pros and cons. Asynchronous means that the commands will not wait for the previous command to complete. It will parallelly run, or you can say it will run asynchronously. right? So it has its own pros and cons. We'll talk more about it when we'll see the Cypress commands. Whereas Selenium code execution is all synchronous. It's not asynchronous. In some cases, you can make it asynchronous, but again, it has its own pros and cons, which we will see later. Then one of the reason why Cypress is becoming famous is support of stub, spice, and clock. Now, what are stub spice? These are the feature usually used by the mocking app, like mocking server, Mockito, and other frameworks are available for that. What they do is you can actually modify the response of the some of the methods and functions or the APIs. So that is possible in Cypress, whereas Selenium does not have such thing. And this, because of these stubs spice, it opens up altogether a different way of testing. Okay, and what is this clock? Clock is where you can control the time of the server. Now, there are a lot of tests where you need to modify the time, you have to test something where you have to wait for 24 hours to maybe update something. Now, these scenarios are not easy to test. But here, since Cypress support these clocks, you can modify the time. Okay. Then intercepting network calls, we have talked about it. Like it can simply intercept the network calls and you can modify the response and the request, whereas there is no such support in Selenium. Now, Cypress is, since it runs inside the same browser under a iframe, the iframes, multiple windows and tabs are not so friendly. Okay, you cannot just simply automate them. You have to tweak or find an alternate way to test these scenarios. Whereas Selenium has a very good support of switching to frames, multiple tabs, or windows. So this is one of the limitation of Cypress, you can say. So that's all about what I had to cover for now. Difference between the Selenium and the Cypress.